Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alyssa Pereira. Today we have faculty guest Marcy LaBelle and student guest Tiffany Mena. And today we're going to be discussing abortion. So to start off, some breaking news came out 2 days ago by the Guttmacher Institute, and U.S. abortions have dropped 7%. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, that number is a little deceptive because while the overall rate has declined and the overall number of abortions in the United States has declined, those numbers have not declined in communities of color or in states that have restrictions against access to contraception, and particularly among groups of women who are economically or socially deprived. And in fact, the numbers of abortions in those communities have risen.
I wanted to talk about some of the common misconceptions surrounding abortion. So what are some of the assumptions based on your research that you've come across?
So I think one of the greatest myths or misconceptions about abortion is that it's chosen by women for selfish reasons. And in fact, the predominant reason, according to numerous studies, that women choose to terminate a pregnancy is because they're not prepared or able to give their child or unborn child, including children that they may already have, the life that they believe the child is entitled to. Either they lack the economic resources or a stable relationship. And so in those circumstances, they make a very, in some ways, selfless decision to terminate that pregnancy. So in most of those cases, in the majority of cases, the women who choose to terminate a pregnancy already have a child and may be in either a tenuous relationship or even an abusive relationship, where bringing another child into the world is not going to be the ideal situation that they hope for their own families. That's one of the myths.
Kind of getting into that, what are some of the demographics of the type of woman who receives an abortion, or some of the misconceptions surrounding that?
Well, as I just mentioned, the majority of women who choose to terminate a pregnancy do so for economic and social reasons. And one of the things that we find is that in places that have restrictions against access to contraception, you have an increased abortion rate. And also, I want to go back to your first question about some of the myths. It is a misconception and myth that restricting access to abortion will decrease the number of abortions. It doesn't do that at all. What it does is it sends women to places and to areas where they have unsafe abortions. And what we see is with restriction on the legality of abortion, what it does is it increases maternal mortality, which is death, as well as a host of health problems that are associated with having unsafe abortions. So restricting abortion, making it illegal, is not going to change the numbers. What it's going to do is increase the number of women who suffer as a result of unsafe abortions.
And do you have anything to add about some of the legality when it comes to abortions in different states?
So there are wide differences by where a young woman may live in the United States. For example, in states like Alabama, I was just looking at some of the statistics this morning from the Guttmacher Institute that we were discussing earlier.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is?
So the Guttmacher Institute is an organization of scientists who conduct research on women's reproductive health, and especially pregnancy and pregnancy termination. They do excellent work, and they provide a statistical and empirical basis for a lot of decisions that are made about women's health, if they're made from a scientific perspective. They also provide a lot of evidence that Planned Parenthood and other organizations use to look at the health impact of access to safe and legal abortion, as well as how legal restrictions affect women's health in the context of this issue. Alabama has laws that require a parent of a minor who has an unintended pregnancy that she wants to terminate, requires her parents to provide not only their consent, but proof, biological proof, that they are her parents. And she can only seek the abortion if they approve of it. And there are no exceptions, even in cases where a young woman may be a victim of abuse from her own parents, or even may be pregnant at the hands of a family member, potentially a father who is now being required to give his permission for her abortion. Luckily, we live in the state of New York that doesn't have such restrictions for minors, and our access to abortion in this state and in other progressive parts of the country promotes the health of women who become pregnant in a time in their life when they don't intend to or wish to.
In Alabama, it's also legal for the rapist to, after serving in jail, to actually fight for custody for the child as well. And that's also, I believe, USA Psychology, also a mental, the person would be affected mentally.
Yes.
On top of having to carry on with the pregnancy unwanted.
Yes, and I mean, apropos to that, there is great evidence that women who are forced to have a pregnancy, to have a child, I should say, from an unintended pregnancy, have poorer outcomes in their physical and mental health, and the children themselves have poorer outcomes, irrespective of who was the person who created that pregnancy, which person impregnated her. So that situation, I think, would only exacerbate the problems that we already know exist.
So what are some of the common differences that you see in these children who are raised in a wanted, or let's not say wanted, but a planned pregnancy versus an unplanned?
Sure. Well, you know, there was a really remarkable study of women. It's sometimes referred to as the Prague study because it was conducted in what was then Czechoslovakia. And what these researchers did was followed these children for 30 years. So they were no longer children at the age of 30, but looked at the differences between children who were born unwanted and those who were very deliberately chosen, and found not large differences, but consistent differences over time. And those differences had to do with poorer mental health, poorer physical health, poorer performance in school, greater likelihood of being involved with law enforcement, having a greater rate of divorce, unemployment, and a variety of other outcomes that persisted over those 30 years.
So going back to something that we touched on, which was kind of living in New York where it's more open and we have more accessibility, why do you think a lot of women or younger women don't tell their parents, or what the effects of that is, or why?
So first of all, the majority of even minors under the age of 18 do tell their parents when they have an unintended pregnancy that they choose to terminate. In the cases where young women don't, they report that they're afraid that their parents will be abusive to them, either emotionally or physically, may ask them to leave the house, leave their home. And in cases where those young women have been followed up, their fears were accurate. And so sadly, there are cases where young women don't tell their parents because of very realistic fears of how they'll be treated.
And about the drop by 7% in abortions, why is it? Is it because there's people having less sexual intercourse, or is it due to other factors?
So as far as we know, people are not having less sex. And what we do know is that the number of unintended pregnancies has not declined. So what's happening is that some groups in our society, in American society, have improved access to contraception. which means that they are able to prevent an unintended pregnancy. And particularly having access to what are called LARCs, L-A-R-C is the acronym for long-acting reversible contraception. So that includes things like IUDs or hormonal inserts. There are some hormonal contraception that you can actually inject into a woman's arm. There are patches now that women can use that are quite effective, and much more effective, for example, than things like condoms, which I think the estimate is that if you were to use condoms over a 4-year period, there's a very strong likelihood that you would have at least one unintended pregnancy during that time. So the issue is having access to those kinds of contraceptives. The Affordable Care Act does guarantee access to those kinds of contraceptives, but if you have no place to go to purchase them, and if you can't afford to purchase them, then you're out of luck. The same is true for access to abortion. So I think you might be surprised and disturbed to learn that in some states, like the state of Ohio, which comes to mind just because I was discussing it with a colleague recently, there is only one Planned Parenthood clinic for the entire state. That's true in other states as well. I collaborate with a group of researchers in Iowa, and they told me that women have to travel hundreds of miles to have access to a safe and legal abortion. So again, back to what we said earlier, those numbers are very deceptive. They show a national trend, but what they don't tell you is what's happening in communities where women cannot afford access or cannot find access to contraception or to safe and legal abortion.
If you had any words for some women who have gone through abortion or are thinking about abortion, what would be some advice or some words you would have?
Well, I think first of all, I would reassure them that there are no harmful outcomes of having an abortion. So this is unfortunately a widespread misconception by those who want to restrict women's access to abortion. The myth is that abortion is harmful to women physically or mentally. There is absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. And in fact, a pregnancy poses more danger to a woman's health and more risk of death, actually, than a safe, legal abortion does. And so I would reassure her that that is the case. There are also some misconceptions that having an abortion increases your later risk for infertility, meaning not being able to have a child later in life. There is absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, we've been talking about the United States, but the number of abortions globally is increasing. And it's especially increasing in countries where women don't have access to contraception.
Is there any final myths or misconceptions about abortion that you would like to share?
I guess the last thing that I would mention is going back to states that restrict minors' access to abortion. One of the premises of those restrictions is that girls and adolescents and young women cannot make good decisions about their bodies. And once again, the scientific evidence shows that that is not true, and that the quality of their decision making is just as good and just as realistic, and they are just as aware of the consequences of their decisions as are adult women.
Thank you for sharing. At this time, I would just like to thank you both for coming, Tiffany and Marcy, and tune in next week for the Community of Scholars.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.